back in the old John Burnham and Company days. So it's great sharing this presentation with you again. Sonia and I are going to talk to you a little bit about, and Sonia's had some firsthand experience of, what we have been experiencing over the last couple of weeks with the civil unrest. And we're not going to get into the whys, hows, or ifs, or what's, causing this, but we are going to get into what, from a property management standpoint, some things that you guys need to be aware of. And then we're going to start with Sonia kind of giving an overview of what she's gone through over the last week at one of her properties. We're going to talk about some simple steps that you guys can take to safeguard your property and your tenants. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about insurance coverage, which I know you guys are all probably going to sign off at that point, but talk about insurance and lease language and some things, practical things from a risk management standpoint that you should look at. So with that, Sonia, I'll give it up to you.
Okay, thanks, Scott. The evening of May 31st was quite eventful for our building downtown. As many of you are aware, there were quite a few protests and demonstrations that were happening. The police were trying to remove crowds and move them. As nightfall came, it got a little more uncertain, and there were people that felt that looting and violence was kind of their MO. So they started, unfortunately, going after some of the buildings with heavy graffiti. It was around 8:30 that night, basically, when they started coming down. And unfortunately, they did hit Emerald Plaza pretty badly. They broke many of our storefront windows. They heavily looted and severely damaged one of our retail tenants. He was an optometrist. You might have seen him on the news. But his display cases were completely destroyed. The entire front of his office was destroyed, and all of his merchandise was vandalized and stolen. So one of the things we want to talk about as we go through this is the first step is awareness. When you know that, as property managers, our number one goal is to protect the properties. We have fiduciary responsibility to our owners. And so keeping up with local and state announcements as they're coming out, monitoring any alerts that are coming from the police, hopefully your on-site security guards and security company are giving you frequent updates. Ours did, which was extremely helpful. And of course, it's always on the news. One thing that really helped was a couple of property managers actually had access to some of the social media, Instagram posts from different private people. They were trying to keep it away from the police. And so getting those announcements ahead of time really helped us. Being aware of your surroundings is huge. The other thing too is when we communicate with our tenants, it's important that you're just giving them the facts. Let them know when a protest is happening, where you expect it to be happening, how close it is to the building, what the timing is. We discouraged our tenants to come to the building and to stay away, which was really helpful. This was on a Sunday night, so luckily in our case, the building was pretty much empty except for our on-site security and a couple of staff members. But we sent out frequent tenant memos with information. That night as it was occurring, oddly enough, we found out that our tenant doesn't even have a cell phone. So it was really difficult to communicate with him. We tried to text. I was sending emails with photos. That got a little challenging. So make sure that your tenant communication, all your contact lists are updated. Make sure your security team has those lists. We were in constant communication with police. They did arrive at one point during the first wave of looters, and then we actually had 3 more waves from 8:30 to after midnight. So they just kept coming and coming and doing more and more damage. So it was important to stay in touch with them. We also, as far as communication goes, what was really helpful is we made sure that we had given, we keep on hand 3 of our emergency response companies that are BOMA members. We keep them on contract with us in case there's something like this where it's affecting a lot of areas, because not everybody can respond. They may be busy at another building. So it was important that we have those contracts already lined up. And sure enough, the first company we called, they were busy helping other buildings. So we went down the line, called the second building. They were able to make it through the police blockades, get to our building, and start helping to board up.
Let me just comment on that.
Yeah.
Sonia, I think that's so important to add. We had a couple of clients that were involved in the first incident in La Mesa. And, a lot of the first responders and a lot of the vendors that were there to help, were already doing other projects or already doing other sites. So it's important to have, 2 or 3 people on your call list. So like you said, you had to go to your second, the second, one on your list. So
right.
Important. Yeah.
It was, yeah. Obviously keeping our building staff up to speed. Luckily we have a system which is called immediate alert, where we have all of our emergency numbers of our building staff set up. We can send one text and it goes to everybody at the same time, so everybody knows what's happening. Making sure that our emergency response company that was able to show up knew what to do, because we knew that they were going to have to deal with their insurance companies the next morning once the adjusters came out to see everything. So that was real important to keep in communication with them. So.
Super.
Protection. So there's Scott's got some great bullet points here of really important things you need to make sure that you're looking at. One of the things, a couple of unique items about our building, as many of you know, we are a mixed use property, so we're with the hotel, and we had a lot of exterior planters that had rocks inside all the planters. And it didn't occur to us to remove those rocks. They're now removed. The next day we certainly did that, but we found that some of the looters did use some of those to break some of the windows. They had hammers, they had crowbars, they had all kinds of stuff, but that was something that we needed to know. But we made sure that our security team had our parking garage doors closed so that people couldn't get in through the parking garage. With a mixed use facility, we have different entrances. So that was important to make sure that the hotel had their entrances blocked off. We had ours blocked off. Our security guards were standing 24/7. And then eventually we did have the glass boarded up, not only to repair the windows that were broken, but we had everything boarded up. I'm not sure if you've been downtown, but it looks a little bit like a war zone.
It's tough.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah. That C Street, corridor all the way to Broadway, from first, second, fourth, fifth, all the way down to front. It's kind of eerie.
Right, and our security cameras were really important too, because the police needed to get those. So luckily we had cameras already installed. It's really important that you're making sure your cameras work on a regular basis, because sometimes cameras they're not recording, or they're just view only. So you want to make sure you're looking at that and updating those systems. But that was real helpful to have as well.
Well, and if somebody committed a crime, which in this case certainly they did, it really helps the police if you have that backed up, hopefully in a cloud somewhere, so that you can present that to the police or the detectives that might take on that as a crime. So
exactly, right. One thing that was interesting too, Scott, we have, we're in a high rise, and so a lot of our emergency stairwells, they exit all the way to the street level. And two of the doors that got broken are glass, and that led into our stairwells. So we were worried that they were going to get up into the building, but luckily the way we have it, it's all secure. They can't get past into the tenant spaces, but that was.
Well, and for life safety reasons, you got to be careful. You can't barricade the stairwells, because, people got to get out of the, evacuate the building. So
yes, yeah,
you're in, and you can't lock those doors. I mean, you can lock them from the outside, but if they were to get in, that's a huge problem.
Yeah, so we worked with our emergency crew to make sure that when they boarded those up, they were still operable. So that was a consideration and something to keep in mind.
Sure. I'm going to talk a little bit about the response, and this would be, we talked about awareness, extremely important. We talked about communication. Again, all that stuff needs to be up front. Awareness is every day. You need to be aware of communication. You need to have that protocol in place, calling trees, make sure that you can communicate to your stakeholders, your property owners. If their equity partners need to be involved, lenders sometimes want to know what's going on. And then obviously any customers, vendors, et cetera, everyone needs, you need to have a plan together. And then we talked about obviously protection, some things that you need to, be diligent on if something is happening. And then of course, the response, and that's after something has happened. And, first and foremost is, when you get there, assess the damage. And, personal safety and protecting lives is the first priority always when you're assessing the damage. Make sure that the property, is safe, that it's, even though it's been damaged, that it's stable, that everything, if there's fires have been extinguished, that before you grant anybody okay to go in and assess the damage. Once the life safety concerns are addressed, then you can take responsible steps to protect the remaining assets. All right, your insurance company wants you to do this. They'll pay for you to do it. So anything that you can do to protect the asset, and the operations, fine to do. Obviously, notify law enforcement. Make sure that they're aware of it. In the protection standpoint, we didn't talk about this, but make sure that you take pictures before anything happens. Take video. Make sure it's date stamped and time stamped, so that you can use the before and after. And it helps tremendously in any loss adjustment situation if there is a claim. And then videotape afterwards. Make sure that that's date and time stamped, and take as much as you can. Again, this is going to help it's going to help the claims assessment and the claims adjusting that much better. Obviously, contact your insurance broker and or insurance company, and notify them of, there should be a claim notification form. Obviously, you're going to want to call all your key stakeholders. If you've got ownership that's outside of town, maybe you've kind of kept them in touch what's going on, and now this has happened. Let everybody know. Obviously, your tenants are going to want to know, can I come in? Can I not come in? Is this something that's going to affect me? And obviously, vendors, anyone that's maybe was going to be dropping off something, they all need to know as well. So that's all part of your communication. There's some things that you might want to do on a, more of a PR standpoint, and, from a community outreach standpoint, and, from a risk mitigation standpoint, obviously. Those are things that are kind of outside of our control, but those are some things that you need to be aware of. There might be some things that you want to, if you're going to fence the property afterwards, to put up something that's, that the community is going to maybe enjoy, fencing instead of looking at this, burnout building. And then keep a detailed list of all expenses, including, your cost to clean up, to protect existing property, all your labor, your time and expenses, any of your staff members' time and expenses, right. And of course, any materials that you've incurred. Keep a spreadsheet, keep the receipts, because you're going to want to submit that to the insurance carrier when you submit a claim. So
hey,
all
Scott,
that stuff. Yes.
Hey, Scott, back on response real quick. I know that I've had this at other issues that have happened, but maybe specifically for you in La Mesa, there's times where you have, depending on the type of damage you have, the city has to get involved, and they will do what's called tagging. It'll either green tag, yellow tag, or red tag. And basically, it basically lets you know, based on the degree of damage, whether you can actually enter the premises.
Right.
And that's something that has to be coordinated as it's happening pretty much sometimes. Did you have that?
Yeah,
with
and
La Mesa
that's a great point. And sometimes there might be a delay.
Mm-hmm.
So, we'll have clients go, God, what can we do? What can we do? Well, that needs to be coordinated. You can still make sure that, personal safety is okay, but yeah, you got to be careful about that.
Yeah.
Sure.
And one more point too. Hopefully, if you're on the property management side, you already have who your insurance agent is, who your claims person is. Hopefully they've already provided you with the necessary claim forms, so that when something like this happens, you're not having to dig and find it. You can immediately have it at, at your fingertips, or, saved in a file that's convenient, so that you can make the proper claim. Another thing that's important too is that if you have an on-site security team, they're typically required to provide an incident report. And that incident report is key, because it should have the details as to what happened, who entered, the timing, what their observation was. You'll have to do one as well, but having that will complement the claim form. So.
Excellent. Now we're going to get into a little bit, about insurance. We're not going to get long into this, but, basically your property policy, your general liability policy, and, obviously workers' comp for any, tenant's employee that was unfortunately injured if an event, comes through. It would be the policies that would generally respond. Obviously, there's other policies that might respond as well, crime policies, auto policies, et cetera. But, typically those are the big three. Obviously, property is, if there's property damage that's been done either to the real property and to your tenant's property, that's going to be the policy that's going to, pay out. Generally, general liability coverage would be bodily injury or property damage claims from third parties arising from your negligence, meaning if a bystander was injured during a civil unrest and they claim that the property owner didn't do everything that it should have done to protect, innocent bystanders, they could get sued. Their general liability policy would respond. We're going to primarily, discuss property insurance because that's going to be the one that's going to probably affect both the owner, landlord, and the tenant. So as Sonia said, claim details are very important. It's when, what, where, and who. Basically just let us know, when it happened, what happened, where it happened, and, was anybody involved in the incident. Obviously, evidence of the damage, including photos and videos, is available, detailed list of extra expenses, which we already discussed. And then information about closures or restrictions by civil authorities. Sometimes your property might not be damaged, but your property might be affected because the civil unrest caused the civil authority to shut down ingress and egress to your property. And typically, if it's within a certain, a mile, 2 miles of your property, and now your tenants, it's not tenantable because they can't get into your building because they've shut it down. It's kind of like 9/11. There were 20 blocks around the World Trade Center that were shut down for, upwards up to 4 to maybe 6 months. And those buildings, the tenants couldn't get in. So they suffered a business interruption loss, even though they didn't have direct property damage, at their property. So always be aware of that.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's a good point too, Scott, because as property managers, we're supposed to be very knowledgeable about our tenant leases, and one of the requirements is that they do carry business interruption insurance for just that reason.
Right.
I've got a quick question here from Barry for Sonia. Were you able to get rid of 100% of the graffiti off the building? If so, what process did your vendor use to take care of that?
Yes, in fact, our building engineers were able to use a solvent. It came off pretty quickly. We were very happy. It was on a huge storefront glass with massive profanity. So we were able to get that off the next day. So that was good.
Excellent. One more question from him. What are you going to do with the plywood that was used? Are you going to store it for future projects and protection?
Well, that's a really good question. Actually, Paris, our property manager on site at Emerald, she and I were talking about this yesterday. Because we have over 100 panels of wood. Wow. That are, boarding up. And so we are probably going to keep a percentage of it on site just in case something happens. We're hoping we're going to be able to take it down within the next week or so. The good news is the demonstrations that have been happening have been, for the most part, very peaceful. So if that continues, we're thinking we'd like to remove it, but we're evaluating that. So that's a great question. I'm not sure if we can return it to our emergency response team, but that's kind of, we're evaluating it. We don't have a specific answer, but I know for sure we will keep a percentage of it on site.
Axe throwing, always a good use for plywood. Also, a comment from Michelle Martini. She is a general manager of Tower 180 at 180 Broadway. They were one of the first buildings damaged on Sunday afternoon and learned a valuable lesson on cleanup that other managers may want to know. The powder pepper bullets that police were shooting at the protests damaged and broke open on their exterior sheet metal paneling. When their power washing company went to wash it off the building, the water activated the power and they essentially pepper sprayed themselves. In the future, during instances of extensive cleanup, they will be educating themselves on potential materials used by the SDPD so that PPE for cleanup workers is correct.
Wow, that's a great point. I'm glad you brought that up.
I haven't heard of that before. That's great.
Yeah. No, we on our building, the hotel faces Broadway, and I know there was quite a bit of pepper spray marks you could see on the outside of the buildings, but I did not know that. That's a great comment. Thanks for bringing that up.
No. So from an insurance standpoint, most property policies are, almost all property policies are going to cover fire, vandalism, looting, from riots and civil commotion. Unlike COVID-19 related losses where there wasn't direct, physical property damage. And most policies have a biological agent, virus, bacteria, exclusion in the policy for it not to be coverage. Of course, a lot of people are contesting that right now. We've got a lot going on through our office with our clients, but almost all property policies are going to cover this. All right. Some things you need to be aware of is that all property policies have a vacancy exclusion unless you're a broker or you can get it removed from your insurance company. And it just basically says that if a property is vacant over a certain period of time, that they're going to diminish the amount that they could pay for certain perils that might happen. So, fire, it might be diminished by 15%. Some of them, there might not be coverage for vandalism, et cetera, things that could happen to vacant buildings. So if it exists, a lot of insurance companies have waived that requirement during, COVID and the definition of what makes a, building vacant. Some of it is like, if it's 30% or less occupied, it's vacant, which is, that's not fair. So anyway, you need to have that discussion with your insurance people just to make sure that that clause cannot be invoked. Timeliness of claim reporting obviously is important. Protect and preserve existing post-damage is important. Business interruption claims are huge, and we're going to get into who tenant requirements and owner requirements from an insurance standpoint. But we had some clients that had losses pre-COVID that were getting adjusted post-COVID. And typically they're going to go back on business interruption previous 12 months or the months that, that you were, for 2 or 3 years are going to try to figure out how we're going to assess how much business you lost, all right, while you're rebuilding your property. And now they're moving forward and they're saying, they're trying to adjust for how much it was would have your business been affected because of COVID. So those loss adjustments are, we're getting forensic accountants to come in and help our clients on this stuff. So it's really interesting how that's being settled.
Scott, I've got another question from Big Bear Barry Garson. Says insurance cover does insurance cover proactive protection board ups?
To board up?
Yes, proactive board ups.
If that's a cost or expense to preserve the property, the existing property from further damage, yes.
Yeah, and just to echo that, our insurance carrier told us the same thing. We're keeping track of all of our costs for protection, which is good.
Super. I hate, Sonia, that happened to your tenant, but it's for this presentation, it's good that we have a real life example of something that's happened, recently. But again, what happened was just, terrible. All right, let's get to leases real quick. So everyone knows that there's insurance provisions in leases. It spells out what the landlord's going to cover, what the tenant's going to cover. Tenants give you a certificate of insurance, which evidences that they're meeting the requirements within the lease. So basically from a property standpoint, the tenant's going to be required to insure its own, contents, stock, inventory, furniture, fixtures, and maybe tenant improvements that they own, even though or they might be required to insure, even though those tenant improvements are permanently affixed to and would, revert back to the owner upon lease expiration. Obviously, the landlord's going to be responsible for ensuring its real property and any permanently affixed tenant improvements that have been amortized, that it's, part of the building. Both the tenant and the landlord are going to procure business interruption insurance, which is going to pay for their lost profits, ongoing continuing expenses, and extra expense they incur from the point the damage happened until it's rebuilt, and then for a period of restoration post completion to get them back to where they were prior to the loss. All right. There's also going to be a clause in there that there's a waiver of subrogation, which they're both going to waive their rights of subrogation. Since it's done in writing prior to the loss, they're also going to waive their insurance company's rights to subrogate. So Sonia's tenant, in this case, who insured its stock and inventory content and fixtures, they're going to come in and replace that, okay? Then they're also going to pay for the business interruption the time that he is down, and then a period of time until he gets up and running for the business interruption. Since he has waived the rights of subrogation, it's in writing prior to the loss, he also is waiving his insurance company's rights to subrogate. Subrogate means that you could potentially be made whole by going after a negligent party for the loss of your property, all right? So in this case, their insurance company makes them whole without a waiver of subrogation. They might subrogate back against the property owner saying that, look, you didn't provide adequate security. If you had provided adequate security, our insured would not have had this loss, all right? And it works both ways. There's a mutual waiver of subrogation in all leases, and it makes sense because you can't have a tenant, a 2,000 square foot tenant in a 600,000 square foot building that causes a fire and causes the building, to be, damaged, $20 million worth of damage, and they can't cover that in liability, limits. So that's why you have the waiver of subrogation. But in all your leases, review your leases and make sure that your tenants are understand what they're supposed to insure, they're required to insure per the lease, and then make sure that that is showing up on their certificate of insurance. And obviously keep those, and an insurance certificate is pretty much just a stamp date and time of what they have from an insurance standpoint. That's really all it means, but it's the only thing that you guys have for them to evidence that they have that insurance in place. Another section of the lease, yes.
Can you talk a little bit about, like in our case with our tenant, there was the stuff that was damaged inside their suite, and then there was the glass that's technically part of the building structure. So maybe talk about how that coverage works.
No, that's a great point. When I first got, and I'm not going to tell you when, but I first got in the business, basically what they did is, and a lot of old leases, still have this language in it where you require the tenant to insure the plate glass that surrounds its, rented space. And so basically there was plate glass insurance, and you would go out and measure the panels, estimate the cost, and then you'd write plate glass insurance. So then it probably, I don't know, about, 20 years ago, they changed that, and then they include plate glass. Exterior plate glass is included in the value of the building, all right? And the problem with that, so it put it back on the owner. But, if you're an owner of a building like Emerald Plaza, where you've got, over $100 million in values, your deductibles are going to be $25,000 to, $50,000. So, the plate glass, you might, go back and have the tenant insure that plate glass. If that's the case, they would have to disclose that to their insurance carrier that they know, even though it's a part of the real property, we're required to insure that plate glass and have them insure it. So, plate glass, just make sure that there's not any limitation, and everyone understands who is picking up the plate glass. And, we had a client of ours over in Kearney Mesa that some people with pellet guns shot out, 40 of their plate glass windows in their office. And, it was an expensive and time consuming, claim. And that was covered by the landlord's property insurance, and it was subject to their deductible, which they had to include in the loss adjustment. So yeah, that's a great point. You need to understand, hopefully you don't see that in your leases, but you might see it in some leases, and you need to be aware of who is responsible for insuring the plate glass.
Right. A couple of little coverage things that happened with this specific tenant. One, that the glass is going to be, make sure that when they replace it, it's like for like. So in this case, it had frosting, and lettering on it. So that's got to be paid for. Yeah. And then the other thing too is that when all of the display cases and all of their furnishings got ruined, we were surprised that the very next morning, our emergency crew came in and cleaned it almost probably 90% of it up by the end of the next day, which was amazing. But one of the things they took up all the carpeting. The tenant hadn't been in there not even a year, so everything was pretty much still brand new and not worn. But they took up all the carpeting, which we were surprised at, because they said that they could not guarantee that the glass had been fully taken out of the carpet. We were thinking, well, no one's going to walk barefoot in there, but they did what they did, and we had to let them do it. And then apparently there was quite a bit of blood because some of the looters cut their hands when they were breaking the glass. So
last cases.
Yeah.
Did your fire sprinklers go off?
No.
Yeah.
No, there was the police, the tear gas didn't make it to the back. See, here's what's weird is the way our entrances were on C Street. So we're kind of off Broadway. So while the police was working with the looters, trying to get them out down Broadway, some of them had gone down the side streets. And then when they came around the back and saw, we were kind of, unfortunately, sitting down a little bit.
We've got another question from Barry. Is there any liability to having well-meaning volunteers help clean up a property after a looting or a fire? If they get hurt, is that something that we need to think about?
If they're volunteers, Barry, you need to check with your work comp carrier and include volunteers on your policy. If you guys are if you're going to use, volunteers to help clean up.
Yeah, my understanding is it kind of falls under the Good Samaritan protection, where the owner wouldn't be liable if they were to get hurt or get cut while they were helping. There's an assumption of the risk, but I agree with Scott to just double check.
Yeah, it'd be better if they were covered for work comp as a volunteer. But yeah, it's that happens all the time. So it's something that, you just need to be aware of. Then the last thing we're going to discuss, and then we'll let you guys have, if you have any more questions. Every lease has a casualty or damage destruction clause in it. Basically, the events happen. Now it spells out who is responsible for what. All right. And so who notices, that an event has happened, then, then you're going to say, all right, how much is the damage? If the damage is under a certain amount, then the landlord is just going to go ahead and fix it. You're going to move forward. If it's over an amount, then the landlord has, a certain period of time to let the tenant know if they're going to rebuild or replace, or if they're not. Then the tenant has a timeline to respond back to the owner saying, that's outside of the timeline. It's not going to work. In San Diego, if you have a complete loss, a lot of these clauses say 90 to 180 days. You might not even be able to get permitting to rebuild your property in that amount of time. So you need to protect your owners, and you need to look at those casualty provisions and the timelines and the notice provisions. Because if they're not met, then the tenant could, as long as the loss didn't arise from the tenant's gross negligence or willful, misconduct, then they could void the lease and walk from your lease. Typically, there's also abatement provisions in the casualty provisions on when rent will be abated and not. And then there's also which I think almost all casualty provisions have, that if something happens within the last 2 years of the lease, right, technically a tenant can, void the lease and move on. So those are contractual, and they're obligations that both the tenant and the landlord have. So you need to make sure that when you're working with the owner and rebuilding and the insurance, that if there's any timelines that are out of the ordinary in that lease, that you work with the tenant and trying to get some variance to that, so that you're not, and your owner is not, in violation of or breach of the contract. So take a look at those.
Yeah. It's the most exciting part of our tenant leases, the insurance clause.
Yeah, exactly. Anyway, that's what we have for you guys today. Hopefully, this, with COVID and now with the civil unrest, things are starting to open back up, which is good. Hopefully we can get some of this stuff behind us and get back to some sense of normalcy. But Sonia, it's always great to see you. We'll have to go get some lunch when we can get out.
That's right.
Yeah.
Right. A couple of things I wanted to bring up that came to mind afterwards is it's real important for your property managers, especially if you've got on-site security. One of the things when something like this is happening, you need to know, is anybody in your building? Who is in your building and who needs to be notified that something's about to happen. And number two, the day that these protests were happening, our security team was working with us and the police department throughout the day. And we had to make sure that we actually had 2 different escape routes, because we were not sure if the looters if they were to come to our building, if they were going to simply loot one of the exterior tenant stores, or if they would actually come into the lobby and try to ruin and destroy furnishings and whatnot. So we actually had to have a plan A and plan B for our security team so that they could coordinate how they would call the elevator, who would get on the elevator, what floor they would go to, where their safe meeting space was if the police was in the building while they were there. So it got really, boy, there was about a 2-hour back and forth where we were on the phone coming up with different scenarios and plans until we all agreed to what it was going to be. So that's something to be thinking of as well.
Yeah, and it's probably to try to anticipate what those scenarios are before they happen, so you can have a plan in place. And and you had to work not only with the office tower, but you also had to work with the hotel.
Completely. Yes. So, yeah. It was constant coordination. And the other thing too is that the tenants don't really understand sometimes what the limit is for your security team. They're like, well, why aren't they stopping the looters? Why aren't they? It's like, no, their job is to simply observe and report. So they were pretty freaked out as it was happening too, you know, but they were videotaping the whole time and standing close enough to the doors that the looters could say, hey, oh, there's security in there, I better not go that way. So, but the tenant needs to understand, you know, what the landlord's responsibility is, as well as what your security team's limitations are. So.
Right. Good stuff.
One more question for Scott from Barry. Is there a timeline on turning in claims from the riots or COVID?
Well, COVID's a moving target. You know, we're instructing all of our clients, even though we're advising them, we don't know if it's going to be covered or not, but go ahead and submit a claim. If that's the route you want to take. As far as, you know, from civil unrest, you know, you want to be as timely as you can. Obviously, you don't want to wait 6 months to turn in a claim. You don't want to prejudice yourself in any claims adjustment or loss scenario. But, you know, it's important to notify your insurance people and let them get the word, get a claims. Sometimes when, you know, like the fires happen in California, you know, the claims adjusters, you know, all got consumed. We also had some events out in Florida. And so there wasn't enough people to even adjust claims. And so there was a delay and we don't want that. So typically, as quickly as you can get it in, we can get a loss adjuster appointed and get to work on getting your clients.
Yeah, and a lot of our insurance companies too, what they'll do is they'll ask that anytime there's an incident, whether it's property damage or an injury of a person, even if you don't think that anything's going to come of it, you file what's called a notice only. And that just gives them a heads up. Hey, this has happened. We're not sure what'll happen, you know, what's going to come of it. And then the second piece to that is you look at what your deductible is. And our insurance company says, okay, if you know that the amount of damages or what it's going to cost you to repair it is not going to even reach your deductible, do a notice only, give us an estimate of what you think the repairs are going to be, because those first few days you're dealing with your vendors and contractors to find out what's it going to cost me to finish boarding up the building for you know, advanced protection. What's it going to cost me to replace all these broken glass, you know, windows and any other damage. So you're gathering those costs and you're kind of estimating it. And once you know that it's going to meet or exceed your deductible, then it's, you know, you got to file.
But it's great to go ahead and put your insurance carrier on notice. Sometimes we see big escalation in costs due to, you know, claims and so sometimes, you know, put them on notice, but you don't want to prejudice yourself if it exceeds your deductible all of a sudden for some reason, and the insurance should pay. So
right. And then you get secondary damages. Yep. Well, any other questions?
None as of yet.
Okay.
All right. Well, listen, Sonia, I enjoyed it. Melanie, thank you. Courtney, Barry, thank you guys Stephanie for setting this thing up. And
thanks, Scott.
If anyone has any more questions, just let Melanie know, and Sonia will answer them. So
nice.
You guys have a good weekend.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank
all
you
right. Thanks, everyone. Have a good weekend. Be safe out there.
Weekend. Bye.
Bye.